When it comes to video games, nobody compares to Atari.
I find Intellivision more sophisticated and lifelike.
Gentlemen, move over for my friend Vic, the Commodore VIC-20.
When Commodore launched the VIC-20 in 1980, it seemed to strike the perfect balance between price and performance. At $300, about the price of a mid-range smartphone today, it wasn't the cheapest computer on the market, but then less expensive computers like the Sinclair ZX80 didn't have a full travel keyboard, or as much memory, or colour, or sound, or the ability to hook up a disk drive, or anything approaching high-resolution graphics. The VIC-20 had all of this. It was a real computer for an affordable price, something to allow your kids to get ahead in a world that was going to be dominated by computers. It was hard to miss with displays at your local department store, and it made the perfect Christmas present. So it's no wonder the VIC-20 was so popular. Well, not just popular, the VIC-20 permanently changed how personal computers were priced and sold. How did Commodore go from the PET, a good but not class-leading computer, to something so popular, and how did Commodore use it to achieve even greater success? This is the Commodore VIC-20 story. Commodore had been at the start of the personal computer revolution with the PET in 1977. They'd refined it with a keyboard that was actually usable. Sales did well, and it pivoted Commodore away from losing money selling calculators to become a profitable computer manufacturer. The company flirted with the idea of going upmarket to compete with the Apple II, producing a prototype called the Other Intellect with 80-column support. But progress on this project was slow. In any case, something else turned CEO Jack Tramiel's eye. One of his employees had designed what they called the Micro PET. Barely a computer really. It was based on the KIM-1, a very simple computer that was a forerunner of the PET, and it was coupled with a keyboard and a video chip with colour high-resolution graphics. That expensive 80-column computer design, the Other Intellect, was considered too expensive even after a cost-reduced version was produced in 1979. But lessons were learned that could be applied to the cheaper Micro PET. What's more, this new machine could be sold to the masses as an entry-level computer. The PET had little competition when it launched in 1977, but by 1979 competition was hotting up. Atari, the video games company, had announced that they were launching an entry-level computer. Motorola were making a cut-price chipset that would allow anybody to make a basic home computer. But Jack Tramiel had his eye on a bigger threat. When Commodore had been selling calculators in the 70s, Japan had flooded the market with dramatically cheaper models. Their mastery of low-cost electronics was threatening the American consumer electronics industry. How long until they were producing simple, inexpensive computers? Commodore were better placed to see the way chip prices were headed. They owned MOS Technology, a company that designed and fabricated silicon chips. Prices were headed south, and with some work, the Micro PET could be turned into a simple computer that placed Commodore in a good position to capitalize on the consumer home computer market that was surely coming and stay one step ahead of any competition. Many of the managers at Commodore were against this plan. Surely the best way to make money was to sell expensive computers and make big fat profits. That's what Apple were doing. There was little to no margin in a mass market computer. But Commodore had discovered there was plenty of money to be made after the computer had been sold. Customers wanted more memory, a cassette recorder or a disk drive to store data, maybe a printer, a monitor, or even a modem. Jack Tramiel famously said, "We want to make computers for the masses, not the classes." If the team could make an entry-level machine that could eventually be sold for $100, Commodore believed that they could take the market and make up the revenue by selling peripherals and software. By now it was early 1980 and the computer market was abuzz with the new Atari 400-800 and the Texas Instruments TI-99, lower cost, colour home computers with sound, joysticks and games. This was the future. These computers would surely soon be in every classroom in the country. They'd be in every home. These kids could grow up using Atari's computers or Texas Instruments. Jack Tramiel was adamant that Commodore needed to make this machine to stay in business and fight off a domestic or Japanese threat. The VIC-20 project was born. Any computer sold to complete novices needed to be easy to use, and the team's mantra became user-friendliness above all else. Neither the Atari 400 nor the Texas Instruments TI-99/4 used a full travel keyboard, and Jack Tramiel wanted to use a membrane keyboard on the new machine to save money. But the VIC-20 team fought to spend a bit more and deliver a keyboard that made the computer easier to use and more user-friendly. They took the unusual step of introducing programmable function keys, something the team borrowed from a prototype of the NEC PC-6000. Although the NEC PC-8000 series that launched in 1979 actually already used function keys, but I'm not sure they actually realized that at the time. Work was split between 3 sites, engineering teams in California and Japan, plus chip work done by MOS Technology in Pennsylvania. The team in California was young. It was a group of 20-something self-taught hobbyists and programmers that were dubbed the VIC Commandos because they weren't taken seriously at Commodore and had to swipe equipment from other teams to get their work done. Once they had something ready to demonstrate, the opposite happened. Marketing folks kept borrowing their development machines to demonstrate at shows. The problem got so bad that the VIC-20 product manager told all Commodore employees that anyone got caught taking items would be fired. Parts of the new computer were little changed from the PET. Both used a very similar version of BASIC, the same PET-SCII characters to create blocky low-resolution graphics, and the same cassette recorder or dataset. In fact, the VIC-20 could load and run simple PET BASIC programs, more than could be said for the TRS-80 color computer, which was completely incompatible with the 1977 TRS-80 Model 1. A computer this expensive couldn't have much memory, and Commodore boss Jack Tramiel gave the team an edict that they could only use 1K chips because Commodore had a huge stockpile of them and they needed to shift them. But even with these bargain basement chips coming from Commodore's own fab, memory prices weren't cheap. The entry-level VIC-20 was never going to have much RAM, 5 kilobytes to be precise, and only 3.5 kilobytes of that would be available to run basic programs. Given Commodore wanted to sell lots of add-ons, it needed expansion ports. The standards-based serial interface on the PET was too expensive, so Commodore designed their own that not only cost less, but was proprietary, so they could sell their own disk drives with a good markup. There would also be an RS-232 compatible serial port to connect to modems and the like. Like the Atari and the TI-99, there would be a cartridge slot to instantly load programs. The program could also run directly from the cartridge, meaning the 5 kilobyte VIC-20 could run full-fledged 32 kilobyte programs. You could also add more memory through the cartridge slot to run large programs from tape or disk. Some, maybe most of these cartridges would be games, and there was a dedicated port for a joystick or a paddle compatible with the Atari VCS. Commodore was under no illusions that games were going to be a big draw. But somewhat surprising for such a low-cost machine, there was composite video output. On the surface, this seemed an odd choice. It added more to the cost to produce this very inexpensive machine, and composite output was only useful for expensive computer monitors, where the VIC-20 was expected to use a regular TV. Neither the Atari 400 or the TI-99/4 offered composite video. It was likely included to get around FCC regulations. This computer didn't need to connect to a TV, and this helped Commodore reduce RF compliance costs. You could of course plug the computer into a TV with the adapter supplied in the box. By spending a little on those few composite output components, Commodore saved themselves a lot on hardware FCC compliance. It was cheaper to produce than Atari and TI's machine, something that would become very important. The VIC's name came from the computer's video chip, the video interface chip. The original version was created in 1977 as the MOS 6560 and not intended to be used by Commodore at all, but to be sold to the general market, maybe for a video games console. It didn't find any takers. Once the VIC project got the green light, it was improved from other video chip work that had been done since 1977. It could now display 16 colours on the screen with character-based graphics up to 176 by 184 pixels. And despite it being known primarily as a video chip, the VIC included 4-channel sound and light pen support. The computer was going to be called the Commodore Spirit. Badges were printed, but then word came from Japan that over there, Spirit didn't mean a friendly Casper-type ghost, but rather a terrifying ghoul from your nightmares. The team were rightly very proud of the new video interface chip, so the new machine would be named the Commodore VIC. But that name seemed odd, like the name of a truck driver or something, so it was decided to add the number 20 just because it sounded friendly. After all, this was meant to be a friendly computer. Douglas Adams picked 42 for the answer to life, the universe and everything because he thought it sounded funny. So now we know 42 is funny and 20 is friendly. The surprising thing about the VIC-20 was just how fast it appeared. Jack Tramiel only gave the project his approval in April 1980, but the final product was showcased at a big reveal just 5 months later in Japan. Despite it being destined to be known as the VIC-20 stateside, in Japan it was known as the VIC-1001 because reasons. I can't find a definitive answer. It was the Japanese general manager who chose the number. It may be because the PET line had been rebranded by this time as the 2001 and the VIC was sold as a budget computer, hence the lower but similar number. By early 1981, Commodore's new budget computer had reached North America as the VIC-20. Priced at $299, it was almost half the price of the membrane keyboard Atari 400, yet the VIC had a real keyboard. It used the same CPU as the Apple II that cost 4 times the price, and with the VIC chip taking some of the load off the CPU, it had similar performance. This was a consumer computer, and Commodore knew consumers wanted games. Not so-so games, something that was going to make kids excited to buy one. So while Tandy and Texas Instruments were producing games you try once then put down, Commodore went to Scott Adams, a developer creating popular text adventures, and helped him create games for the VIC-20. They also correctly realised that kids wanted excellent versions of the latest arcade games. Commodore Japan secured the rights to several Namco arcade games, including Pac-Man. Commodore didn't have the rights to the Pac-Man name in America and Europe, so Pac-Man became Jelly Monsters. With the game looking very similar to the arcade hit, Jack Tramiel suspected they'd get sued for how close the game was to the look of Pac-Man, but he figured he'd put some of the game revenue aside for the royalty settlement and stop selling it, and that's precisely what happened. But by that time kids knew the VIC-20 had the best games and had bought the machine in huge quantities. Reviewers loved many of the VIC's features and gave it glowing reviews. They called out the great user guide, but to be fair, most major home computers at that time had good user guides. The reviewers also detailed the computer's shortcomings. It only had 22 columns of text, and that meant big blocky text which wasn't much use for any kind of business software. Not something that Commodore was worried about. They already had a business machine that they were happy to sell you. But it meant any program that relied on text, like say a Scott Adams text adventure, couldn't display much of it on the screen. But at least there were upper and lower case letters, not a given on computers twice the price. To Byte magazine, the position of the return key was all wrong. The normal position was surely on the top row of letters. With the proliferation of PC keyboards, this seems surprising today and makes the keyboard layout of the VIC-20 seem much more natural to modern eyes. The cursor keys were just 2 keys, and that meant that they needed to be used in conjunction with the shift key. It was all a bit awkward, but VIC owners soon got used to the computer's idiosyncrasies. One oddity was the inclusion of the UK pound symbol on an American keyboard. It's useful to Brits and may have been included to get a leg up in the UK and Irish market, but I haven't found any definitive evidence why Commodore decided to include it. If you know, let me know in the comments. The VIC-20 might have sound and graphics, but accessing them from BASIC was awkward. There was no way to access high-resolution graphics other than displaying custom characters. Clearing the screen was achieved by printing a reverse heart character, very logical, using the same Petsky characters seen on the PET. To change colours required more special characters, and changing the background colour required a direct memory access poke command. Making music meant more pokes. There wasn't even a command to print text at a certain point on the screen, meaning, yes, you guessed it, pokes again had to come to your aid. Commodore knew at launch that due to its design, after 5 or 6 hours the computer would overheat. But 100,000 machines had already been produced. Jack Tramiel made the decision to ship them anyway and put a heatsink on subsequent machines. Strangely enough, few complaints appear to have ever made it back to Commodore, at least according to the VIC's general manager. In Germany it was sold as the VIC-20 because VIC was close to FIC. If you change one letter in English, you'll work out why that word wasn't acceptable. German marketers played up the VC name being similar to VW, but instead of People's Car or Volkswagen, this was a People's Computer or Volkscomputer. When it came to publicity, Commodore went all out. Big adverts in magazines, and this computer was sold not only in computer shops, but in department stores. It was the first computer to be sold in Kmart, a very important general retailer in the early 1980s. Commodore supplied large point-of-purchase displays to make the VIC easy to sell for stores that didn't know a bit from a byte. Thanks to composite output, the VIC-20 shined when put next to competing systems that relied only on RF. Commodore had other advantages over Texas Instruments, Tandy and Atari as well, in that it had an extensive support network not just in North America but in most major world markets. They could help retailers with problems, and it also helped in marketing Commodore's new consumer machine.
Why buy just a video game from Atari or Intellivision? Invest in the wonder computer of the 1980s for under $300, the Commodore VIC-20.
But a masterstroke was hiring William Shatner to head up the marketing campaign. He probably came a lot cheaper than Bill Cosby that TI used in those days, and to the sort of geeks who were going to buy a computer, James T. Kirk was the coolest person in town, with the original Star Trek series being shown in repeats and the 1979 Star Trek motion picture fresh in everyone's minds. He sold the VIC-20 not just as a games machine, although it was great at that. It was also a capable machine to do the home finances, get online or learn to code. The VIC also found a home in schools where the keyboard held up to the pounding of many inexperienced fingers, and it was the introduction for many to the world of computers. The 1540 disk drive was supposed to be available by October 1981, but it seems to have arrived in early 1982. It wasn't cheap. The design meant replicating much of the computer's hardware in the disk drive case, including a CPU. So when you included a disk mechanism, it's no surprise that it cost more than the computer itself. The data rate wasn't fast, which was okay if programs only fitted into the 3.5 kilobytes of usable memory, but with a RAM expansion cartridge you were in for a wait until the program loaded. Tandy was showing there was value in connecting a computer to new online services like CompuServe. Commodore created the VIC modem, $33 of parts that sold for 3 times that price, and it got Commodore's users connected through their telephone line, so long as no one was using the telephone. It became useful to Commodore in more than one way. Obviously it sold well and made a profit. It was the first modem to sell over 1 million units. But the phenomenal success of the VIC-20 meant Commodore's customer service was being overwhelmed. One bright spark hit on the idea of creating the Commodore Information Network on CompuServe. One person at the company was responsible for updating information to answer customers' most pressing questions, and it quickly became one of the most popular places to visit. At a time when CompuServe paid people to upload content, Commodore actually got paid for their customer support site. CompuServe was valuable to VIC-20 owners in other ways as well. There was free software that could be downloaded and used offline. The VIC community increased the value of this little computer and made it an easy recommendation. The VIC-20 was the best-selling computer of 1982 by unit sales, around 800,000. By January 1983, it was the first computer to sell 1 million. In 1980, Commodore had been doing well. It was the third biggest computer maker behind Apple and Tandy. It could now claim to be the largest personal computer company with a $1 billion valuation. Soon, 9,000 VIC-20s were being produced every single day. Commodore had seeded the VIC-20 market with good games. They encouraged third-party software companies with technical information. This was in stark contrast to Texas Instruments and Atari, who started by locking down their systems or even suing companies that wrote games. With the success of the VIC-20, it was quickly flooded with good games that in turn sold even more machines. The best advertisement for your product is a personal recommendation, and there was none better than going to your friend's house and playing a great game. You wanted that experience for yourself. It was common for Commodore to quickly throw a prototype together and present it at a trade show to see what stuck. They'd done just that with the VIC-20. With such interest in the VIC-20, it's no surprise there was interest in seeing what came next, and Commodore either presented or hinted at new models. The first was the VIC-40, shown off in November 1981, only 6 months after the VIC-20 was generally available in North America. The VIC-40 had 16 kilobytes of memory, but the big change was 40-column text. Customers were told that they could upgrade their VIC-20s to this new spec. In the spring of 1982, Commodore were teasing the VIC-30. There was also the VIC-10, a computer that would eventually launch as the Commodore Max, plus something that was being called the Commodore 64. But inside Commodore it became clear having too many models didn't make sense, and the VIC-30, VIC-40 never appeared. But what would happen was the Commodore 64 with 40-column text and a massive 64 kilobytes of memory. It was priced at double the price of the VIC-20, but for that you got a lot more. Commodore felt it was a natural competitor for the Apple II Plus for half the price. What's more, it used VIC-20 peripherals, which meant less work for Commodore to refresh their money-making line of add-ons. Commodore's retailers, on the other hand, were split. On one hand, they had a great new machine that they could sell well, but on the other, they were annoyed that Commodore had produced a machine that usurped the VIC-20 only a year after it had launched. They needed to retrain staff and stock new hardware and software. The C64 was terrible news to Commodore's competitors, Atari, Tandy and Texas Instruments. TI were particularly annoyed. The large tech firm was expected to take a big chunk of the home computer market, but no one was buying the TI-99. They gave it a full travel keyboard and slashed the price. To Commodore, this price drop was a red rag to a bull. In the 70s, they'd been happily selling profitable calculators using Texas Instruments chips, until TI undercut Commodore with their own line of calculators at a price less than the cost Commodore could buy the chips. Commodore had to pivot to computers, and here was TI trying to muscle in on their new patch. This was personal. The war started in 1982, and soon the TI-99's price was lower than the VIC-20. Despite arguably having a better product, Commodore matched the TI-99 on price into 1983 as prices got lower and sillier. Both machines were now $100. But the VIC-20 cost less to manufacture, and this game of corporate chicken had to end sometime. TI threw in the towel in mid-1983. The price war made the VIC-20 affordable for many people. It was about the price today as Dyson's cheapest vacuum cleaner. And despite the C64 being the new kid on the block and a bigger profit centre, the VIC-20 still got its fair share of adverts. It provided an excellent upgrade path to its bigger brother, and you could use the same peripherals. Dip your toe into the world of computing with the VIC-20 and grow with the Commodore 64, especially as its price was also coming down. In the fast-moving 1980s home computer market, by 1984 the VIC-20 was out of date. Commodore produced a successor of sorts as the budget Commodore 16 that summer. It used the same case, the same keyboard layout, but it had 16 kilobytes and 40-column text for about the same price. But as it was incompatible with the C64 that by now had a vast array of excellent games, the C16 was always going to suffer and sales were never strong. Production of the VIC-20 ended in 1985. More than 2.5 million had been sold, but it wasn't missed with the Commodore 64 going from strength to strength. Commodore got a lot right with the VIC-20. They took all the best parts of the PET and cost-reduced it with chips from their own company, MOS Technologies. They added the features customers wanted: colour, great sound, a joystick port and a cartridge slot. It was expandable using edge connectors that cost nothing to produce. They were part of the circuit board. And Commodore created a compelling yet affordable range of peripherals that added real value to the customer and real profits to Commodore. They encouraged software developers, so there was a wealth of software, unlike Texas Instruments, and they sold the VIC anywhere and everywhere, unlike Tandy. They were smart to skirt FCC rules to produce something cost-effective, unlike Atari, and they included a necessary full travel keyboard, unlike Texas Instruments, Atari and Tandy. And once customers were in the Commodore camp, trading up to the C64 was the next logical step. Use your existing dataset, VIC modem or disk drive, things that were expensive in their own right. Given how good the C64 was, why wouldn't you stick with Commodore? The VIC-20 might have been inexpensive, but the next major computer to launch took low prices to a whole new level, the British Sinclair ZX81, and that will be the subject of the next video. When the ZX81 video is out, it will be linked on the right, or if you want to see a video on Commodore's first computer, the PET, it's also there. Thanks for watching to the end, and I'll see you in the next video.